Good morning, everybody. It's time for another military history Q&A. Because someone was silly enough to send me some questions about some things, I did a deep dive, because I like to do that, and give you a good, elaborate answer. We're going to talk about World War II German weapons of mass destruction. What were they, and were there any? And yes, I believe there was. And we're also going to paddle back up the old river from last week, talk about anti-tank rifles. I'm going to break down where they came from, how that started, and which ones there were, because that seems to be the question I just cannot get rid of. Isn't that right, Tom? And at the end, I'm going to do a couple of what-if questions. One that's been lingering, I've been playing with, and I just can't come up with a really interesting answer because there's only one answer to that question. So, anyway, let's start with German weapons of mass destruction. There's always been rumored and talked about how far with the German nuclear bomb project, and as you know, that is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. And I went out to Lower Silesia, and I went to Peenemünde, I went to Mittelbau and Kummersdorf, and I think there's more to it than what we've been told, but it may not be what we think it is. We've also seen the targeting map, the nuclear targeting map of Manhattan that the Luftwaffe had commissioned somewhere in 42 or 43. I have half of a copy of it for you. So there was an indication that the Germans during World War II were working on weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons with the aim of delivering them. And believe me, when we get to the miniseries I'm working on what I found in Lower Silesia, you'll see a different picture of what that all was. But when it comes to practical and applicable and versus rumors and fantastic, I took a look at a few things. Now, some years ago, a book about first-hand German accounts from the front and from D-Day came out. There was a two-part series, Stories from the Front or something. There was much to do about how this was a fabrication, because there was not enough specific details or coordinates and so on. And so some of the conclusions and some of the stories was discarded by some people. And I took a look at it because I thought one of the stories were rather interesting, about a German weapons officer named Bergmann. He was stationed, this was an account that was written down while he was alive and promised to not publish until he had passed away. It makes it kind of hard to question it either way, but let's try to go with Mr. Bergmann's account. He was stationed outside Calais in anticipation of D-Day with a 30-man unit and a group of multi-rocket launchers. In the book, they were referred to as Typhoon. Now, the Typhoon was one of those things that started at Peenemünde, and Dornberger and von Braun had their hand in it. In fact, von Braun worked very diligently on making the Typhoon work. It was a weapon, ground-to-air missile, that would send several missiles up, and they were very inexpensive. It was an air-fuel bomb of, it wasn't entirely sure if it was a mixture of oxygen and coal dust or it was a chemical or kerosene mix, but it would fly up amongst the planes. The initial rockets would explode and disperse all this powder. Then several more rockets would follow and ignite this enormous cloud of coal dust. Like you see, the coal dust explodes very violently. And we're looking at an aerial air-fuel bomb to bring down the planes. Let's see. Did you know the 88 flak needs 28 seconds to reach 28,000 meters? So the last project Werner von Braun was working on was this, because that would make that altitude in 6 seconds. Now, on Mr. Bergmann's account here, he was in charge of a Typhoon weapon system. I don't think he was. I think, let's go with the hypothesis that there was a Mr. Bergmann, an Officer Bergmann, that was sitting outside Calais. He had an area destructive weapon, an area weapon. It was a rocket-launched weapon. While it was the ground version of the Typhoon, because it could be used for ground use as well, obviously, it would be a massive area destructive weapon if it was used against a ground target. At the time of the invasion, they were outside Calais, and of course they didn't make it, so they began their march towards Normandy. Because of the heavy air umbrella and air cover, they could only travel at night, and they did not start their march towards Normandy until July 24th. And once they got there, they were positioned in a time and place corresponding with the Allied mass tanks preparation for Operation Cobra. That's where it gets interesting. He was in position 5 miles from the target, as they were instructed to be, to fire their rockets at and spray their aerosol that would then be ignited and would literally destroy and kill everything within a 5 by 5 mile radius. And it was, interestingly enough, said that 5 miles from the target center, that might not even have been safe for the crews. They apparently lamented that a lot of their grenadiers and soldiers that were doing flank protection would not be able to get away from the explosion. They themselves would have to take cover. They were exposed to a random artillery strike by the Allies, and their rockets and their launchers was destroyed, and they were not able to launch what, according to Mr. Bergman here, would have been a strike that would have, or could have, destroyed 1,000 tanks and all the soldiers within this radius of 5, 6, 7 square miles. That's a lot. That's a serious destructive bomb. Now, air fuel bombs are not new. Air fuel mixture, whether it be coal dust or kerosene or whatever it was, there's a lot of things that will create an air fuel detonation. And if the Germans had this technology, which they did, and that is where this gets interesting. Now, whether there was a Mr. Bergman and he was there and he was carrying Typhoon rockets in order to do this strike, it's hard to verify. But I'm saying it is actually plausible, and here's why. He also mentioned the Typhoon 2, which, if you look it up, actually comes out to being an Austrian, more modern weapon system. And von Braun doesn't talk about the Typhoon 2. I was just there. I saw what he was working on. I don't think he was, or they were, carrying Typhoon. I think they were carrying good old-fashioned Nebelwerfer rockets. Because the Nebelwerfer was a tested rocket system that dates all the way back to even before the beginning of the war, of crude large rockets that would be fired about 5 miles, and they would carry high explosives, just like the rockets the Russians used, the Katyusha rockets, unguided, an area assault weapon that was initially designed or claimed to lay down smoke, but also capable of laying down chemical weapons, gas, things like that. They had a large warhead that were fairly large, and there was tons of different variations. They were easy to launch, they were easy to transport on trucks, carrier systems. There's even stories from the front where the soldiers would simply just take the crates out, aim them towards the Russians, and ignite them electrically. And they'll generally be going that way. Now, there were thousands of Nebelwerfers built. Thousands of different rockets for the entire war, different sizes, different variations. They were cheap to make. They were easy to make. There would have been a good test bed for a weapon like an air fuel bomb or coal dust bomb, because the Germans had the technology, and we know that because it was used in Nebelwerfer form at the uprising of Warsaw. So they had them in Nebelwerfers. There's even pictures of this. And they also had been used at the siege of Sevastopol, where literally the air-fuel mix would just pump into buildings and then ignited, and they would suck the life out of everything and destroy whatever they were in. It's a very violent explosion if you ever get to see a Moab or something, which you probably won't, because if you see it, you'll probably be too close to it and you may not find it enjoyable in any way. Why do I rant on about Mr. Bergman? Because there was more. There was an article that was written a few years ago labeled Warheads, An Historical Perspective by Don Kennedy. I think it was on page 56, labeled Tactical Missile Warheads. It states, there's evidence that the German army may have employed a form of FAE on the Russian defenders at the World War II siege of Sevastopol. German 28 centimeter and 32 centimeter Wilhelmshaven barrage rockets were employed in mass arrays, with groups of 32 centimeter diameter liquid incendiary rockets fired first so as to disperse their content of gasoline, kerosene, or naphtha as a weapon. Don't know what that is. Naphtha? Don't know what that is. Followed by, seconds later, by a 28 centimeter high explosive rocket that would then make it possible to detonate this fuel-air mixture. The Soviets noted widespread personal casualties without a mark on them, a typical comment concerning the victims of blast injuries. The Germans plainly understood the fundamentals of air-fuel bombs, or here referred to as FAE. It was demonstrated also in the Typhoon weapon system for the pioneers. And the 32 centimeter round in question was probably the 32 centimeter WFK MFL-50. We know now that the Germans had air-fuel bombs arrays in Naval rockets. And I know they were tested. And they were probably used on the Eastern Front. They must have been. If they were at the siege of the Battle of Warsaw, the Warsaw Uprising, they most certainly would have been at the front, fired at the Russians. And we do know there is some indication that the Russians at one point in the war contacted the German emissaries through Sweden, that they were very upset that the Germans were cheating by using these massive area destructive weapons that the Russians classified as chemical warfare, and if the Germans didn't stop or knock it off, they would actually retaliate using chemical weapons. So something was going on in the Eastern Front, and there was a large amount of dead Russians that kept piling up in front of the German lines. So using a weapon system like this would make sense. But it gets better. Yes. There was an Italian gentleman, ended up being Dr. Sippemeyer. He was born in Milan in 1899, lived in Austria, worked for Steyr. And he eventually started working for the German Air Force. His party membership was 66, so he was an early party member, therefore a devout Nazi. He ended up working with the SS and with the Air Force, and he worked on these aerosol-fueled bombs and guidance systems. And Seppemeyer is a verified person. He's identified in what he did after the war. Lots of interrogation reports on him from the U.S. military trying to figure out what he was actually doing. Since the outbreak of the war, Seppemeyer, he, besides also serving as a flak replacement department, like everybody else had a replacement job, he worked at the Research Institute in Regensburg, and he said, or it was stated, that development of the weapon system he was working on did start in 1942. And the rapid progress was astonishing to everybody, made it very interesting for both the Air Force and the SS and the Army. And it should be rapid progress because air fuel bombs and the weapon system and how this was deployed and the chemicals have been known for a very long time, so it cannot be new. According to an American CIC report, his group had 35 employees that worked in Vienna, Lofta, Tyrol, and the most important research program they were working on was the development of a high explosive warhead with an anti-aircraft missiles, Ensign and Schmetterling, were to be equipped. Those missiles, I believe I saw them in Peenemünde. Also, von Braun's brainchild. He was part of doing whatever they could to start bringing down Allied bombers, because apparently nothing else was going to do it. Now, according to the CIC report written back then, Sebelmajer's team, they tested a small thermobaric explosive device near Vienna in 1943, and it contained 60 kilos of this mixture of coal dust and liquid oxygen. And apparently Windows was broken all the way up to 1.5 kilometers away. So obviously it worked. After the Allies landed in Normandy, of course, this project was sped up. And the SS was now very interested in this and tried to get them to the front, according to this report. That does not mean that if they made this work, they started work in 42, they made it work in 43, I don't see why this would not have been sped up before 44, and it could have been, because a lot of accounts and a lot of paperwork, surprising amounts of paperwork have been destroyed or gone missing after the end of the war. At this point in time, he was now an SS Oberscharführer, Mario Sebelmajer, and so there's a connection between this research and the SS, which is not really relevant to what I'm trying to say. But they also claim that another test had been done in 1945, and it was done outside of Berlin, which leads us to Kummersdorf, where there has been witness testimony of an extremely large explosive device having been tested, which ignited and destroyed everything in a 600-meter radius, which is a pretty good air-fuel bomb radius. They also have tests by Lake Starnberg in 1944, and where everything was destroyed in an area up to 4.5 kilometers, which is pretty close to the 5-kilometer radius that was mentioned in the Calais story. So what we now have is an area destructive weapon, an air-fuel bomb of sorts, that will destroy everything within 4.5–5 kilometers, which can be fired by a rocket system about 5 kilometers away, just on the edge of the envelope of where it's safe to be. And apparently the German military had called for these to be actively built and done and created at the Dor Mittelbau works, where they also created or built the V1 and V2 rockets. This has been documented in the National Archives, that specifies that a plant in the Harz Mountains or Nordhausen would be used as a production site for oxygen bombs. So now we have another verification that they were up to something. But it gets better. Now, you remember they were looking at 60 kilos of explosive before. They were working on a 5-ton bomb. Now that couldn't be lifted by a V2 rocket. Maybe a V3 or 4. Maybe dropped by a bomber, if a long-range bomber was available. That, incidentally, would correspond with the radius of the bombing map that was found in Göring's papers of Manhattan. Just saying. Now, after the surrender, Sebelmajer was interrogated by the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, who was very keen on knowing what he was doing, and he had explained to them in a report that his pulverized coal dust, gasoline, or even other liquids, a lot of different things they could use, would be more efficient, cost efficient, easy to deliver, and with a roughly same effect as a nuclear bomb. Maybe there's something more to this whole air-fueled bomb. But of course, the Germans had a problem, because how are they going to deliver it? How are they going to deliver it to a place like Manhattan, of all places? This map that was found in Göring's papers had the concentric circles of a blast, of a yield of a Hiroshima-sized bomb, which destroys 3–4 kilometers completely, and the rings sort of matched that yield. But that yield is also matched by a very significant and a large air-fuel bomb, or by, say, the cascade of rockets that would saturate an area with this oxygen and coal dust and then ignite it in a 5×5 kilometer radius, destroying and killing everything. But if the Germans didn't have the big planes, they had a few, but they probably wouldn't have made it. They might have. It would have been a surprise if they showed up. might not have made it back again. How otherwise could the Germans have thought to deliver such a weapon? Aha, this is where it gets fun. They were testing this. In 1942, in Peenemünde, both Dornberger and von Braun was doing rocket tests, trying to fire missiles off submarines. Now that worked out quite well, but it also worked with the submarines submerged. Again, we're back to the lowly, cheap Nebelwerfer rockets. Initially, they mounted a platform on the back of a submarine 511, submerged it down to 50 meters or 15 feet. That would probably be 15 meters and 50 feet. Oh, damn, can we agree on one number, please? And that worked out just perfect as well. Now, of course, that brought attention to a whole lot of people, that the Germans fired rockets from submerged submarines. Yes, the Russians were not the first ones to do it. We were not. The Germans did it. And they did it with a Nebelwerfer. A Nebelwerfer rocket that we now know could contain and saturate an area with liquids, coal dusts, and ignite them and destroy and hold area of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 square kilometers. So what we can take from this, now they did say they stopped this operation because for 1943, because they wanted to build bigger rockets, something like stick a V1 or a V2, and they built this self-floating container that would hold a V2 rocket and be towed by a large submarine. One of such containers were built, and it was found in Hamburg after the war, where the rocket would be stored with its fuel control room, and it was be towed to a launching place in the ocean, not where it could reach New York or England or wherever, and fired from there, and then the container would be discarded. But they already had, in 42, a means of delivering a weapon, an area weapon of mass destruction, by submarine. And there was no problem with the submarine, with the rocket's accuracy of firing, if the submarine was at a slow pace. Incidentally, remember that 1942 was the time they started the submarine tests. 1942 was also when Seppenmeyer started working on these rockets. And Sevastopol had happened in 41, 42, where they experimented with the battlefield use of this weapon system. Not to mention, of course, it would have been in place and existing in 44 for the uprising of Warsaw. So, yes, the Germans had a weapon of mass destruction, an area weapon that could be deployed by submarine, that was tested successfully in 1942 and used in battle. So if you go back to Bergmann's account from Calais, I don't think he was carrying a Typhoon system. I think he was carrying a Nebelwerfer rocket system, and on some perhaps 6 half-tracks, support trucks, accounting for his men, the number of men he had, some more supply, a couple of command half-tracks, which would make it kind of hard for a string of vehicles, of 10, 15 vehicles, to make their way. That's why it would take time. That makes sense. They would have been in place. That would make sense. The Allies would always prep up before an attack with artillery and planes bombing. That makes sense. He got caught in the wrong place. Could have changed history, or at least slowed it down. They couldn't use this system by the beach because of the weather. Because if it was too windy, it would disperse all this, and it wouldn't be able to ignite it. So the weather was an issue. It had to be rather not windy and a little dry. Would be good. So there's a lot of places like that in Russia. So certainly, I wonder if they didn't use it there. I find it entirely possible to believe that the Germans were working on an air fuel bomb of various sizes, had deployed these in the field in various ways, and were planning on using these against New York, England, Moscow. I do know from my research that the Germans were planning a major deployment of a large-scale weapon in 1946. So they had something on the drawing board that was large. And it is interesting to take a look at the nuclear detonation map of Manhattan versus what the destruction of a heavy air-fueled bomb would look like. The damage radius is roughly identical. And if you look at the modern submerged rocket launches and the ones from 1942, well, I mean, I guess that's what it looks like when rockets break through the water en masse. Just interesting note that they had some ideas and they were marching down that road. Had the war lasted a little longer, I believe we would have seen some larger scale use of weapons of mass destruction in that sense. Now, we are back to the next question about anti-tank weapons, specifically anti-tank rifles. A couple of questions came in. Tom wrote me one asking about if the possibility that the Polish anti-tank rifle of World War II had been copied by the German Panzerbüchse. And other question talked about which one was the first anti-tank rifle ever made. So I figure we'll pile it all together and let's talk about anti-tank rifles of World War II, starting with the origin. The very first anti-tank rifle was developed during World War I by Mauser. Gee, surprise there. The Mauser 13 millimeter, actually 13.2 millimeter, known as the T-Gewehr, was basically an upscaled Mauser K98. It was a large, and it would fire, I said, a 13.2 millimeter munition, 13.2 by 92 millimeters. It was developed and put in the field around 1917 when it became clear that more and more armor started showing up on the battlefields around Europe. The British tanks and the French tanks. They were inspired by the large bore game hunting rifles used in Africa to bring down elephants and so on. And one would think that there was also a use for those at some of the armored vehicles that had been driving around in the decade leading up to World War I. Or at least people must have taken shots at some of these with larger bore rifles before World War I broke out. But I can't find anything on that. I just find it rather plausible. So they built about 15,000 or so of these. It was a weapon that was carried by two-man crew. It was rather crude. No magazine, one single round chambered. Also no buffer for the shoulder to reduce recoil, so it was not exactly the most comfortable weapon to fire. And had a bipod, pistol grip, iron sights that was set to about 300 to 500 meters. Loader would carry and the shooter would fire, but they were both trained on the weapon so they could take turns. And firing a bunch of these no padded, I could see some switching going on there. Initially, the Germans had fielded a armor-piercing rifle bullet 7.92, a K bullet as it was called. It proved inefficient against the Mark series tanks and the lighter, even the lighter French tanks or tankettes at the time. That were armored just a little bit too much for that. That's why this came about, and it was referred to as the 13 millimeter TUF, TUF, Tank und Flieger. That designation stuck because they would also shoot at airplanes with this thing. It has a decent, very decent muzzle velocity of 2,580 feet per second, which is quite decent, which is about 780 meters a second. That brings us to the other part of the question. Was the German Panzerbüchse 38 and 39, which is not that far apart, a copy of the Polish anti-tank rifle at the time, the Maroszek 35? let's break them down, just for the hell of it. The Panzerbücher 38, an early war 1939 tank design that was designed by Gustav Werke. And it was based on the World War I Mauser T-Gewehr that initially started it. But it featured an artillery-like breech system, which was different than the Mauser. I'm not entirely sure where the inspiration then came from. The PCB-38, it operated a manual bolt action system. It only fired individual rounds, and you had to reload every time for firing. It was produced by Rheinmetall Borsig, and they made 14 to 1600 samples. They were never really the standard rifle, as it was cumbersome, it was fairly expensive to make, and it was rather heavy. So they ended up making the 39. 38 fired an armor-piercing 7x92 rifle cartridge, or 7.92x94. It weighs 36 pounds, and the muzzle velocity was 3,970 feet per second. And it had 25 millimeter of armor penetration at 90 degrees slope, up to 328 yards. An odd number to test. Now, the 38 was complex to build and manufacture, and made it expensive. So he decided Gustav did, to revise the design and make the R39. The barrel was a little longer, made a little lighter. They retained the vertical block breech and the same caliber, but now the breech block was not controlled by a lever on the pistol grip, which was a little strange. It also was rather distinct from having two magazines, supplies fitting on either side on the receiver to make it easy for the shooter to reload. They had nothing to do with the actual chambering of the rounds, it was just for easy storage. And the PCB-39 did go on to be named as the German standard rifle of World War II. It weighed about 25 pounds. It had a good muzzle velocity at 4,150 feet per second. It was sighted with a V-type notch, and armor penetration at 25 millimeters, again at 328 yards, so that's about the same. It also had a muzzle brake, which is interesting because the T-Gewehr also did not have a muzzle brake or any of those creature comforts that would reduce recoil. Some 25,300 of these were made by the time of the Russian invasion, and they were actually put to good use, and the soldiers were happy with them. So, if we then turn to the Polish Maroszek and see was that the inspiration for the German Panzerbücher, I'm going to go with a no, because the German Panzerbücher 38 and 39 had almost an artillery style breech block that was very different, although it was inspired by the T-Gewehr that was basically an upscaled Mauser 98. And so was the Maroszek, was pretty much an upscaled K98. And it had all the same features, except it did have a pistol grip. It featured an internal magazine of 5 rounds, the same bolt carrier system as you would see on a Mauser. And let's face it, most of the anti-tank rifles, short of one, we'll get to that, was basically an inspiration of the upscaled Mauser, because that's what anti-tank rifle was. You needed to shoot and penetrate more, so you just upscale what you have that works. And let's face it, everybody copied the bolt action loading system of the K98 at one point or another. Still to this day, that's in use. The Maroszek was an interesting rifle. It was developed very much in secrecy in Poland in the 30s when they realized they needed an anti-tank type rifle. It fielded the 7.92 by 107 millimeter DS lead core cartridge. Again, the cartridge was based on the 7.92 by 57 millimeter Mauser round, but of course it was bigger. 3,500 samples were produced, and it was actually a very successful rifle throughout World War II. Loaded weighed about 22 pounds, which is not overly heavy. It had very good penetration against Panzer Is, Panzer IIs, Panzer IIIs. It was actually so good that after the fall of Poland, 800 of these were sent by the Germans to the Italian military that used them successfully, and the Germans themselves used them successfully throughout the war. The muzzle velocity, however, was 1,275 meters a second, which is 4,180 feet per second. But the bullet was quite a bit different. The armor-piercing round had a hardcore full metal jacket that weighed 14.5 grams, and because of the high muzzle velocity, it was really efficient against shallow angle targets. Instead of ricocheting, it would literally stick and punch through about 20 millimeters and then still have enough to rattle around inside. So to answer the question, no, I don't think the Germans, which had a parallel development with the Maroczek on their Panzerbuche series, they were both inspired by the Mauser, because everything was, but the Panzerbuche were completely different in design and setup, and they had a similar performance, although I would think the Polish being lighter and easier to handle and had an internal magazine, which none of the German rifles did. I would think if the Germans had tried to copy it, it would have led to a better German design that would weigh less, that would be far more comfortable to handle, and it would require less maintenance. It would be cheaper to produce. This is actually one of those where I say that the Polish rifle would have outperformed the Germans, especially when it came to cost of production, manufacturing, all the different aspects that would go into a rifle. But I will say it was very highly inspired by the Mauser and by the T-Gewehr, which had been in use for 20 years before the Maroczek came under development. But then again, their copying is flattery, right? But if we're going to talk about anti-tank rifles of World War II, as we are, we have to talk about a couple of the other ones, because some of them are rather cool. So, of course, the Germans, always striving to outdo themselves, they came up with a Schwer Panzerbuche 41, which was bigger, 2.8 centimeters. The SPCB 41. Now, it looked a little bit more like a small anti-tank cannon. Had a shield, little wheels on the affutage, but it was lighter. Therefore, it came under heavy anti-tank rifle designation, and it was used throughout the war and had great penetration, good performance. However, it weighed 500 pounds. There was a lighter version that was about half that weight, made for paratroopers. Still, a rather heavy gun, but it was light enough that it could be moved by hand and installed, and therefore it came under rifle designation. It does look like the bastard little brother to the PAK 37, really. Now, there was one problem with this. Although it was very efficient, rather cool, actually I kind of rather want one. Now, it had a recoil mechanism, had a carriage, had a shield, 28 by 20 millimeter cartridge. That would fire at 4,500 feet per second up to 550 yards. It was equipped with an open sight for distance of 500 meters and a telescopic sight that CF 1x11 used on the PAK 37 that could be installed as well. The gun could be broken down into 5 different pieces, where the lightest one was 68 kilos, 62 kilos, which still a heavy piece of kit for infantry to carry around in the field. However, the interesting thing about this thing was it had a tapered barrel, with the caliber reducing at the chamber at 28 millimeters to only 20 millimeter at the muzzle. The projectile carried 2 external flanges. As they went down the barrel, that would squeeze the diameter and keep up the muzzle pressure. It would keep up pressure on the projectile, leaving the muzzle at 1,400 meters a second. which is rather significant. It also had a hydraulic recoil buffer and a spring-driven recuperator. The carriage was a sprit rail with suspension, wheels, rubber tires could be removed, so it could be lowered significantly. And that whole process, typical of the Germans, only took 30-40 seconds and could be done manually without tools, which is important if you need to reduce your presence visibly on the battlefield rather rapidly, because Russian tanks are coming at you per se. The armor penetration is not bad. At 100 meters, you would penetrate 60 degrees sloped at 69 millimeters. At 90 degrees sloped, 75 millimeters. At 400 meters, it would penetrate 90 millimeter angled, about 40 millimeters. And at 500 meters, at a slope of 60, it would penetrate 40 to 52 millimeters, which is really not bad. There's a armor piercing with a muzzle velocity of 1430 meters a second, and a fragmentation now 1400 meters a second, and with a range of about 1,000 meters, whereas the armor piercing only had an effective range of 500 meters. There was one problem, however, with this wonderful little mini cannon that was also installed on vehicles and so forth. It was expensive. About 4,500 Reichsmarks for one unit. That doesn't mean anything to you unless I tell you that a Pak 38 cost about 10,000. So for twice the money, you would have an actual 60 millimeter field cannon that would destroy T-34s at far larger distance. One interesting note on this: it is documented that this rifle penetrated the lower plate of the front of a JS-1 tank, which is fairly well armored. So that's a testament to how effective this little weapon could be. And I say little because it is still smaller and lighter to move around the battlefield than a Pak was. Although, I'd probably rather have a little Pak 37. Don't know how much they were. I still want one. But anyway, that was a bit of a heavy history. There's a couple of other anti-tank rifles of World War II that's worth mentioning now that we're here anyway. So generally, anti-tank rifle of today would be useful if you shot against turrets and drivetrains, tracks, things that are vulnerable, and being a rifle, it might be a little easier to hit. The Russians worked on that, and the most numerous and well-known Russian anti-tank rifle was the PTRD 1941, so PTRD 41, and I am not even going to attempt to pronounce the Russian name for it. I'm sorry. It fired a 14.5 by 14 millimeter cartridge. It would penetrate up until about 550 yards, about 25 millimeters of armor. It had a muzzle velocity of 3,300 feet per second, and again was a bolt action loaded rifle, and it weighed about 38 pounds, so a bit more than the German contemporary. But of course, the Russians also had another 41, the Simonov PTRS 1941. It was a bit heavier, a bit more complex, but it using the gas recoil system, it had a 5-round magazine. It was a bit more complex than all the other single shots. It was a little bit more expensive and difficult to manufacture, so there was not that many of them, but it was very useful, powerful, and it could be broken down into 2 parts and carried separately, which is a beautiful thing. And then actually, the PTRD, just as the 41, they came onto the battlefield when German tanks and armor was increasing even more, so they're trying to shoot at the vision ports and other openings, just like all the others. However, this was so popular that when captured by the Germans, it was pressed back into German service and renamed as the 14.5 Panzerabwehrbuche. And it did fire, the PTRS fired the same, a 14.5 by 114 millimeter cartridge. It's a bit of a thing. At 500 meters, it would penetrate 25 millimeters if there was 0-degree slope, and the wind was just about right, and it was not facing the sun. But now, of course, just across the Pacific, the Japanese was not going to be outdone when it came to our European contemporary anti-tank weapons, mostly fielding a 14 millimeter round. No. They were going to do something completely different. They did a 20 by 124 millimeter ammunition and the Type 97 anti-tank rifle, the stacked magazine. It weighed about 100 pounds, and the crews did not love it. In fact, they hated it. It took 4 Japanese soldiers to carry the bleeding thing. Took 2 to operate it. It had to have the rear shoulder mounted into the ground, otherwise it would literally kick the operator out the trench. It had to be mounted in a fixed position. Now, it was a powerful weapon against the very early war tanks, but when the Sherman showed up, not so much. It was complicated, it was expensive, it was heavy, it had a recoil that would kick a horse into space. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. And of course, the British, not wanting to be outdone by the Germans, had to have their own anti-tank rifle, the Boys anti-tank gun. That was built and designed, technically, by British Captain H.C. Boys, a designer at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. It centered a 13.9 millimeter cartridge. It was originally known as Project Stanchion. Its sights was aligned between 300 to 500 yards, depending on what model, and it would penetrate about 25 millimeters armor plate, but I don't know at what distance that was. The Finnish loved it, as it would shoot through the early Russian T-26 tanks during the Winter War. The airborne loved it because they could carry it into battle. It was a bolt action, but with a magazine, one ejected, one chambered, and it was rather popular in the beginning of the war against early weaponry of the enemy. Eventually, it would be outdated, the P-8 would enter service, and both for the British and the Americans, why have an anti-tank rifle when you can just call in a bunch of Shermans and do the job, or have a bunch of planes bomb whatever it is that annoys you on the battlefield, which is also why I never could find any American anti-tank weapon or rifle brought into service. When you have cannons, what do you need a rifle for, right? And now, the reason why I had to eat several pastries and drink a cup of coffee before I started this was John. He wrote me some time ago a what-if question. It's a lengthy question. I'm good with lengthy questions, but in order for you to have any idea of how to interpret my very short answer, I have to read it to you. John writes, I'll be as specific as I can. If I was dropped off in the middle of nowhere, neutral weather, not too wet, not too cold, with normal weather patterns, which given these days would be hot as hell, and without thinking about lions, tigers, or bears, and wearing standard issue uniform, my weapon, 1 box of MREs, box, not a case, and I was allowed to choose one single item other than what's mentioned above, what would I choose? And I'm not allowed to say a fully stocked Jeep, airplane, helicopter, or a Sturmgeschütz, which obviously would be my first choice. John, I do this for you, and I need to retire. What would I bring with me? Well, standard issue uniform. You are not saying I'm getting all my field gear with me, so I'm assuming uniform, rifle, MREs, but no standard gear. If it was the standard gear, I would have all the standard gear I needed on my webbing, and I really wouldn't need much else. However, leaving me with, in the middle of nowhere, or wherever, with this, I mean, the first thing and the last thing that springs to mind is I need a knife. I need a knife to dig holes, to cut branches, to cut branch for fire, to create whatever I need to survive, floats, ropes. I need a knife. and the single answer, and you said I could pick anyone from any era, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, I gotta go with a knife. Some big, heavy Bowie would sort of be what I gotta go with. Of course, you also left me under that thesis without a canteen or any way of carrying water. Possibly I could create something to carry water into nature, but again, I would need a knife to do that. So I gotta go with a knife. I mean, my initial thought would be, you know, a female Swedish masseuse, and when she gave up any massage, I could just eat her for nutrition. But again, I would need a knife. So I gotta go with a knife. I asked one of my other dudes, an SF dude that I worked with, see what his thoughts were, just to throw it out there. So I give it away to Jay.
So I was recently asked by my friend Tino if what item I would bring if I were dropped into a non-inclement weather situation with only the bare bones survival. I have a pistol with 1 mag. I've got 1 MRE, which equals no MREs because I probably won't eat that, especially if I can't choke it down. And just some basic survival, uniform, gear, whatnot. And so he asked me, and I said, what was the one other item that you would bring? And I thought, okay, water's going to be key. So I need something that will help me. Also, I have no ability to chop or build, so it came down to those two things. Is can I find water? I could dig a gypsy well if I had something to chop with. So I think I would probably go with like an M48 tactical kukri, or something along the lines I could chop with, dig with, a Japanese not a tool knife. Those are got a big thick blade. So I would probably go with some form of knife, and that way I could whittle down something to create fire, make a bow with one of my sheath strings or something to create fire. But I think a knife. I was going to say a life straw so I could drink out of anything, but I don't think he'd let me say that. So that's my answer. It's a knife. And I'm sorry, I'm driving, so it might be a little wanky.
Nah. So I can't really make it much of a more of an elaborate, interesting answer, because the blade just comes to mind. Even maybe even a hatchet would be good, but a Bowie knife would do the same job. What I would need, a compass would be nice, but we got sun and stars for that if we need to. You didn't say if my rifle had any munitions. Use it as a club, I guess. If I had all my basic gear, then I don't know, maybe a toothbrush would be nice. How am I out there? You didn't say that. But anyway, that's kind of where I'm going to have to go with that. I also wanted to bring you a cute picture from the past, just as promise you picture of the week, and it's always about war, death, and destruction. So I thought I'd bring you a picture of a pretty Russian girl directing traffic at the end of World War II, because we can all enjoy pretty Russian girls that direct traffic in the middle of World War II, right? I mean, duh. Anyway, gotta keep it short today because I have a whole bunch of stuff to edit. The mini-series on the Ostwall is coming. The mini-series on the forts is coming. The mini-series on the German secret weapons project, the Riese, is coming. So I actually have to do a lot of editing. Not enough sleep. More coffee. Send me coffee, someone. Okay, please. Anyway, send me your questions. Military history Q&A at mail.com. lostbattlefields.com. All the pictures from my Q&As are up there, so all the videos. Follow me on YouTube. It makes my life easier. And I will see you in a week or two. Take Take care. Behind me is some 34 kilometers of tunnels. This happened in battle. This is a must-see. Whoa, this is huge. They actually held out in here for a month. This is an amazing place to visit. They are not even sure how many bunkers are in the forest. Are we classifying this as a human bone? Look very much like a femur. The Russians fired a 203 point blank. It's just truly an amazing part of history that most people have never even heard of.